the Sun is so proud of this part of its participation that we keep inviting the same people back, and I'm really the person who had to be introduced because you know all of them, you have heard them and challenged them. To my delight, sometimes you have challenged them over a period of several years. I never challenged the man to my immediate right, Charles Cordray. He is, among other things, the best known person who works at the Baltimore Sun. The reason I know that is because I travel a lot, and it frequently is my experience that I will be introduced to some group and people will tug at my coat sleeve and say, "Do you know Charlie Cordray, who is on Washington Week in Review?" And I say, "Yes, I know Mr. Cordray well and regard him highly." And then I hear that he says that he didn't know me, but the fact of the matter is, but that's all right. It sort of hurts my feelings, Charlie, but not long. Charlie Cordray has been covering military events in this country for longer than some people would have memory about that. He knows more about the Pentagon than most of the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he is a valued member of our repertorial staff. On the other side is Steve Browning, who once was the op-ed page editor of the Baltimore Sun. He was when I came to the Sun, and when I came to Baltimore, one of the places where people pointed to me that I absolutely must never make a change was on the opposite editorial page of the Sun, because it was stimulating, because it attracted the kind of readership that we were interested in attracting, and because it had an intellectual bent. Well, that sort of challenge is not an easy one for me. I don't leave things alone very much. So Steve now doesn't run the op-ed page. He is our diplomatic correspondent in Washington and does a wonderful job of it, and we're very proud of him. I did not make a change in Joe Stern. Joe Stern has been the editorial page editor of the Baltimore Sun for an extended period of time after foreign correspondence and after Washington correspondence. He is a man whose judgment I value, and I hope that those of you who read the Baltimore Sun experience the kind of learning that I get out of Joe's editorials in the Sun every morning. I am pleased, therefore, to present all of them. The format is very simple, and you know about it because you have been through it before. What I would ask all of them to do is to what Charlie just reminded me a minute ago, write tight, which means don't be long-winded, Charlie. And then after 25 minutes or so, we would like to open this up to you, because we think that the feedback we get from an audience of this caliber is exceedingly valuable to the Sun. To moderate the program, Joe Stern. Thank you.
Thank you, Reg. I appreciate the introduction. This is the 9th time that we have appeared before this group. When we made our first appearance, we were awaiting a new administration to take office. And at that time, as I recall, there was a great deal of emphasis in the thinking of this country about the military competition between the Soviet Union and the United States in rather classical Cold War terms, if I might use such a phrase. What strikes me now, as we are waiting for a new president to take office, is how much the emphasis has changed from 8 years ago, how much the world is now preoccupied with economic issues, and how economic issues influence the course of world affairs and diplomacy and power balances and so on. My first reading for tonight is the Gospel according to Gorbachev. In his speech at the United Nations, he said this: "It is now quite clear that building up military power makes no country omnipotent. What is more, one-sided reliance on military power weakens the other components of national security." This is what he said about his country. Today he announced a massive cut in his defense budget. At the UN, you know, he announced a cut in his forces, but what interests us, or should interest us as Americans, is whether those same words might be applied to our allocation of resources. My second reading for tonight comes from a joint statement issued by Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. They said, "The United States, which used to be the preeminent economic power in the world, has lost its hegemony. As nations express power, it represents a shift in the economic weight in the world." The other text I would like to introduce tonight also comes from a Republican and a Democrat, this time Henry Kissinger and Cyrus Vance, writing in Foreign Affairs a couple issues ago. They said, "U.S. political leadership in the world cannot be sustained if confidence in the American economy continues to be undermined by substantial trade and budget deficits. For these reasons, the weaknesses of the U.S. economy may be among the most serious and urgent foreign policy challenges of the next president." I think we all realize that even though President Reagan came to office vowing to balance the budget, take care of deficits, and increase American productivity, all the trend lines have been in the opposite direction. And I think as a result, we are seeing a situation where the United States no longer is the sole economic superpower in the world. I remember when Prime Minister Nakasone of Japan came to the United States a couple of years ago, there was a great outburst of Japan bashing from the Hill, people talking about leaving all of those Toyotas rusting on the docks at Yokohama. 1 week later, after he had departed Washington, the nation's capital waited with great trepidation to see if Japan would buy our next issue of Treasury bonds. The fact is that we are shipping out $100 billion a year to foreign ownership to finance our trade deficits and our budget deficits. And as this shift continues, we do lose a lot of our sovereignty. We do lose a lot of our control over world affairs. And I think it hammers home the point that if we don't put our domestic issues in order, our domestic matters in order, we are going to face a world in which we are just one of many competing economic superblocks where our interest rates, something that hits home to the individual as much as anything, is determined by bankers in Tokyo and Frankfurt. So I think George Bush, as he approaches his next term, might have cause for joy that his Secretary of State has just concluded a term as Secretary of the Treasury. Our next comments will come from Steve Broning, who is the Sun's chief diplomatic correspondent.
I concur entirely with Joe's analysis, which is based, I think, on the fact that the character of the world struggle for power, which characterizes any national effort, is changing. It's changing away from the military. It's changing perhaps away from strict bipolarity, and it's changing more toward the political and economic. And as Joe said, the persistent budget and trade deficits by the United States in this kind of environment will leave us much in the position that Blanche DuBois in Streetcar Named Desire was, and that is we will have to depend on the kindness of strangers, which is not the best place for a great power to be. The reason we got where we are today, or on the verge of being where we are in the Bush years, is because there's been a sea change at the core of world politics, which is the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. To recognize this change, we have to recall just a couple of things, perhaps. one of President Reagan's first speeches or press conferences was when he said that, speaking of Soviet leaders, he said, ever since the days of Lenin, they have felt themselves required or permitted to lie or to cheat or to do anything to advance Soviet interests. I'm paraphrasing. This, he said, applied to any Soviet leader that he'd ever known. In his farewell speech to the United States, the American people, a couple of days ago, he spoke of the present leader of the Soviet Union, General Secretary Gorbachev, and he said, of all things, we wish him well. And what's happened here? What's happened here is the Soviet Union, for reasons about which we can probably discuss later, has concluded that its traditional course of development and action was self-limiting, that the Soviet economic system was, as Gorbachev said when he came to power, in a pre-crisis stage. It's probably worse than that. In any case, the Soviet Union, for its own reasons, many feel, decided that the time had come for an accommodation with the United States, as expressed, for example, in a historic arms control treaty to do away with the intermediate-range nuclear missiles, a treaty signed at the Washington Summit in December 1987. How Gorbachev got there and how the Soviets got there, as I said, is a subject of some debate in academia and in the State Department and the White House and within the Bush administration and the American and European publics at large. President Reagan's admirers, sympathizers, contend that it was President Reagan's policies of taking a hard line, of waiting the Soviets out, of ordering a military buildup, of challenging the Soviets in regional conflicts such as Afghanistan, such as Southern Africa, which forced the Soviets to confront their own limitations and could force them to an accommodation. Others, experts in academia, contend that the Soviets would have come to this conclusion anyway, that they, more than anyone else, are aware of their own limitations, and they, more than anyone else, are aware of the possible solutions. Whatever the reason, we have come to what people in the incoming Bush administration consider to be a sort of a watershed period, a period of great opportunity. The opportunities are created by these changes in the Soviet Union, by the better relations between the Soviet Union and the United States. A critical question to be answered as we watch will be, are the reforms going to work? Will Gorbachev be able to stay in power? If the answer to those questions are yes, does this mean that there is less risk for war, less risk for confrontation? Does this mean that either side can now allow, with certain equanimity, to observe simply revolutions or small wars in third world countries that were previously seen as tests of will between the East and the West? The questions are unanswered. And the reason they're unanswered and the reason they're of such consequence, or because they are unanswered and because they are of such consequence, the incoming administration, as we've been told, is going to undertake a review, a strategic review of American capabilities, of American needs, of American requirements in terms of diplomacy, in terms of its military power, in terms of its economic power. This is a good thing. It's a good thing. Additionally, it appears, because the men that President Bush or President-elect Bush has chosen are themselves prudent men, men who know Washington, men who have no desire to change the world, but are willing to accept it and improve on it. I think we can discuss some of these questions as we go down the road this evening.
Ladies and gentlemen, I too think I'll quote the gospel at this point, since Joe did. I'll take my text or thought from the New Testament. According to John, a passage in John, every man serves the good wine first, and when men have drunk freely, then the poor wine. And so now you've come to me. I've heard a lot of talk recently, and I read a lot and even sometimes write some things about the Cold War having ended. It seems to me it ends in stanzas. I hadn't realized until it ended recently that it was still going on. But the fact that it is under discussion prompts me to suggest one or two points, or to give you a few reminders. It was 43 years ago, barring 2 months, that Winston Churchill gave his speech, his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. And what he said that one still thinks of, besides the reference to the Iron Curtain, was that the Soviet Union does not want war, it wants the fruits of war. And I raise at least a question of whether that has changed. I think that the situation in Europe, while it's in a state of flux, is still this, that the Soviet Union is 4/5 of the way from its pre-war borders to France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. There is still a line down the center of Europe. World War II was fought to restore a balance of power, as indeed was World War I. And the Cold War was fought to restore a balance of power, Stalin having replaced Hitler. Now, the question in my mind, and I think that I reflect a question in the minds of those foreign policy establishmentarians who are coming back to Washington this weekend, is whether Gorbachev, having discovered that his system does not work, and that his country is broke, is genuinely going to reverse Russian history, which at least is 500 years old from Ivan the Great. And I am one of the skeptics, I will confide to you. But I think this is the question that we in the West must have to ask ourselves. Is this man a press agent, or is he a statesman? Is it press agentry when you announce that you're going to cut 500,000 men out of your forces, but you're going to do it 2 years from now, which means you don't have to do it at all unless the West behaves? I don't know whether this is statesmanship or press agentry. I'd like to discuss now briefly just 2 points, one foreign, one domestic. Steve referred to this big review that's going to take place in Washington. It's already late because the president-elect has named only one man to the Defense Department and only 3 to the State Department. And his national security advisor, of course, was named early, Brent Scowcroft. There's a lot to do. This review is going, I think, to deal with the question of whether containment, the prevailing policy since George Kennan dreamed it up, will continue, whether our present arms control approaches are right or new ones should be devised, whether our deployments of forces in the world are right or should be changed. And look for a phrase to be more and more heard called burden sharing, which sounds like a very dull and boring phrase, but what it refers to is simply this. Can the United States, having spent itself blind supporting the world, any longer continue to do that, or must there be a revision of the sharing of the burdens about the world, particularly within the alliance, the Western alliance? It seems to be an accepted figure that about 60% of our defense budget goes to the defense of Europe. That if it is so, and it's very hard to calculate this, but if it is so, that's on the order of $175 billion a year. And I think you're going to see big debate, particularly in Congress, over burden sharing. And the domestic one, and I'll wind down very rapidly here, is this. A reasonably sensible defense budget has been sent to Congress calling for $315 billion for fiscal 1990. There will be an awful lot of argument about this. Look for the great 2% debate. We're going to hear the great 2% debate. 2% is the amount of increase that budget has, that is, after adjustment for inflation, $6 billion. We could sit here tonight and cut $6 billion out of the budget, and the country probably would not suffer a bit. But what is involved in this kind of debate is that the politicians, the Democrats and the Republicans, decide what position to take on some small sum, 2%, that the nation's future hinges on this matter. It becomes a symbol, and so they debate it. Meantime, downstairs, the boys in the back room will work out a defense budget that will keep the forces about the way they are. If they cut it much more than that, the forces will have to be reduced. But there will not be the big shifts that all the hullabaloo indicates to you that you would expect. That's about all I think I want to say about that. I'll leave a little time for questioning, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Before opening to questions, I'd like to just throw out a couple a few statistics that we can keep in mind during the next 45 minutes or so. The national debt is now $2.8 trillion. The deficit this year will be about $155 billion, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. The interest on the debt will be about the same amount. In other words, we're spending as much on the interest of the debt as we are running up a national deficit. The United States has become the world's largest debtor. We owe $500 billion abroad. And just when our trade deficit is still well over $100 billion a year, and although it might go down next year or this year a little bit, it could go up again. And just one last figure so we can keep this all in perspective. There are 5.5 billion human beings on this poor planet right now. 88 million more will be added each year. So by my calculation, if George Bush makes it for 8 years as Ronald Reagan did, we'll have 700 million more human beings to share this planet with. The question is, are we really in as bad shape as some of these economic debt figures would suggest, particularly figures involving pension debt on the part of corporations and so on. There are either pessimistic economists or optimistic economists, and you can take your pick. There are economists today who assure us that the interest rates are going up, and others that assure us that the interest rates are going down. I'm not an economist, so I can't say that. All I can say is that there seems to be some unanimity among the economists I read that U.S. savings rates are at almost an historic low of 2% of gross national product. This is due to a combination of things: the indebtedness of the federal government, the indebtedness of corporations, and this has been added to by the leveraged buyouts, the indebtedness of individuals because everybody receives 3 or 4 free credit cards in the mail a week, so that we as a society are on a big credit card binge at almost every aspect of it. Now, what does that mean for our world position? According to, I think, what you can say is an economic consensus, it means that we are not accumulating the capital we need to invest in our factories to improve our productivity so that we can be competitive with the rest of the world. And I think everything to do with indebtedness has to come down to the question of whether we can improve our productivity and be competitive. And if we are competitive, then of course the American ability to influence world affairs increases commensurately. The question to Mr. Cordry is whether the rise of economic superblocks will change world affairs and lessen our economic problems to some extent.
I guess I'll now demonstrate how little I know about economics. I think that what you said at the end about what really amounts to transnationalism is very much coming about, that the economy is global beyond peradventure of a doubt. One danger that's perfectly obvious, and I wish my colleague down the line here, Steve, would comment on this because it's more or less in his bailiwick, is whether the so-called unification of Europe in 1992 is going to result in the erection of walls and sort of a rebirth, reinvigoration or something of nationalism in this country, and whether you're going to get more really devastating kind of competition. But I think that we in the West have worked out these problems over and over again, and so I don't tend to look for the worst to happen. But I really wish Steve would comment on it.
like everything else in international politics, nothing is guaranteed. This administration, the architect, the incoming administration, certainly Secretary-designate Baker went into this with a great deal of detail yesterday and today in his testimony before the Foreign Relations Committee. The incoming administration certainly hopes that the new European bloc is redefined and perfected, if you will, in 1992, is going to be outward-looking. The architects of this new Europe promise that it will be outward-looking, but there are certainly no guarantees. There are tendencies, residual tendencies with Europe, which will tend to push it inward, and which will tend, despite promises now, pledges now, will probably tend to pull it inward when there are conflicts. I mean,
Well, what will we do in response?
the jury's out. The epidemic reaction of many Americans is when there's a problem of trade, when there's evidence, indisputable evidence of unfair trade, is to retaliate. So far, certainly in the Reagan administration, I think that in the incoming administration, the tendencies at the level of the executive are going to be to do everything we can to preserve free trade, which is to our advantage, obviously, on a level playing field, as they say. But it's very, very difficult to forecast. Joe is probably much more qualified to answer this than I.
See, we loved your question.
I think that you asked, what are we going to do about it? Well, we've already done something about it. Most of the rhetoric coming out of Ottawa and out of Washington talks about the U.S.-Canadian Free Trade Pact as a great advance for free trade in the world. Actually, it is the beginning of the erection of a North American super bloc, economic trading bloc, which and our trade with Canada already is almost as great as it is with the nations of the European community. We trade more with Ontario than we do with Japan. The trading within the EC is greater than transatlantic trade. Within 10 years, some economists think that north-south trading of the East Asian Rim nations will be greater than trans-Pacific trade. So I think we might be moving into a world in which we're going to have three major trading blocs. The question, I think the great question for the Bush administration is how you take this situation, which is developing before our eyes and I think is unstoppable, and yet preserve the kind of global multilateral trading system under GATT that this nation built after World War II. And I'm not sure that I've seen anything out of this the new administration yet that indicates how that's going to come about. Why doesn't the Baltimore Sun produce a more balanced editorial page which emphasizes optimism and a more upbeat view of the world and stops being so pro-Arab in its presentations?
Left wing.
Left wing.
And left wing. All I can say is that, well, we'll think it over. The speaker said that he reads the Globe and Mail in Canada as well as the Baltimore Sun and finds a completely different world view in the two newspapers.
That is correct.
And that he feels that he and a lot of other readers of our newspaper are victimized by some kind of tacit censorship which prevents him from getting information from us than he can get from the Canadian newspapers. Is that a fair?
That is correct.
Yeah. I wish the Canadian Prime Minister was here tonight. I would like him to be up on this platform to tell us about the Globe and Mail. But since he isn't, I can only say that you're absolutely right, sir, that we all have been around the world, all members of this panel. We've all read different newspapers in different countries, and it's very true that newspapers published in a particular country do reflect some of the mindset of that particular country. They reflect the locus from which that newspaper is looking out at the world. I think it's almost inevitable. All I can tell you is that we regard ourselves as serious professional journalists. We do try to produce in this city a newspaper that gives a very comprehensive report of world events. We try to comment on it in a far-reaching way. We don't try to be mealy-mouthed on our editorial page. We express opinions, but they are clearly identified there. And on our op-ed page, we certainly run articles that represent a vast spectrum of opinion. And in our letters to the editor, we bend over backwards to publish letters that are critical of our editorials. I'm the last person to say that we're doing a good job. All I can tell you is we're trying to do a good job. And if you want to compare the Baltimore Sun to the Globe and Mail, I'll take them on anytime.
Can I just add one thing? I certainly cannot speak for the chief of the Washington Bureau, but to the extent that this would come under our purview, I would love to have a copy of this article, so perhaps we could have somebody assigned to see if it's worth following up.
The speaker mentioned that our gross national product is leaping ahead so quickly, so far, so fast, that these debts that some of the pessimists talk about really represent a much smaller percentage of the GNP, and therefore are not quite so worrisome as some people think. I can only say that you pick your economist and you hope he's right. What worries me and what worries my staff is this, that if it's true that we are shipping out $100 million a year in our national wealth abroad, $100 billion, and we have to pay interest on that ad infinitum, and this builds up year by year by year. I think what worries some people is that too much of our wealth, too much of our national wealth over a period of time will be placed in the control of foreign nations, and therefore constricting the power of the United States and its role in the world. Now, it is true that the gross national product is rising, but an awful lot of that gross national product is in the service industries, not in manufacturing, at least until the last 2 years or so. So we have to worry about the profile of our gross national product as well. Is the profile of our national product in a manufacturing mode that guarantees the continued industrial strength of this country? I think when we look at what's happened to our computer chip industries and some of our smokestack industries, I think a national mood of caution is in order.
Okay, could I just say something that's on a less complicated plane? I didn't bring the budget with me tonight. I'm beginning to regret that. I forget how much of the budget is just solely devoted to the payment of interest. Do you know, Joe?
$150 billion.
Now, you see, the point here is that George Bush, although nobody's condemned us yet for this, but somebody will before the evening's over, George Bush ran a campaign in which he did indeed discuss a lot of issues, but we were more interested in the fight with Dukakis. But he laid out a lot of programs. But the unfortunate thing is that he can't get to them. And one of the things that would help would be a much lower annual expenditure on interest, without regard to all these other things, which I agree with. Yes, the GNP is growing and all that. You still have got this enormous interest payment every year, growing. I think it's the third largest part of the budget. So if you want more for education or child care, those things that Bush talks so much about, that would be a good place to get if you didn't have this tremendous debt. That might not be economical, but I think it's common sense.
I just can't summarize that question. But I'll be glad to have my colleagues try to answer it. Why don't you,
Well, it wasn't a question, was it? I mean, why?
It is the question, all right,
why didn't we have these stories? I guess
the
that's-
stories.
Okay.
All right, let me say something else, and I'll excuse myself.
No, wait. Can I
Wait, no,
answer, can I answer your
something-
question? You did ask a question, so I think we have a right to answer it.
All right, sir.
Okay. About these pitched battles with the Cubans
Yes, sir.
was the only thing I know about.
Do you know about them?
No, I don't know about pitched battles with Cubans. What I know about is there have been a series of skirmishes around a tank farm near Fort Howard in Panama, in which shots have been fired by American Marines and American soldiers who, during the night, have seen these infiltrators through infrared scopes and believe from time to time have wounded some of the people who have infiltrated. These incidents have been disclosed by the Pentagon. From time to time, they've been reported in the newspaper. We have no confirmation whatsoever that any of these people were Cuban. And if they were, believe me, it would be in the newspaper. It might even be on the front page.
That's what I was looking for.
The gentleman mentioned that some people project a situation where Japan will own 10% of the U.S. economy within a number of years, and he asked why the United States, which was so generous in dealing with Japan after World War II, now finds itself in such an unfair trading situation. You can approach this several ways. One way would be to point out the structure of Japanese society, which makes their governments almost impotent when it comes to trying to get that society to open up to the rest of the world and accept foreign products. You could answer it by saying that one of the reasons is that it reflects our own domestic deficits, which have to be financed by the Japanese, and a function of financing those deficits become the trade deficits. This is a very weighty question. I can't answer why this situation exists, but I would say this, that in the Japanese-U.S. relationship, Japan has become the world's chief creditor country. It has assets around the world that now total $700 billion. As I mentioned earlier, the United States has become the world's chief debtor country with $500 billion owed to the rest of the world. We are dependent on Japanese capitalists and bankers to finance our debts, and we will remain dependent until we stop being in debt to this extent. And I think that when, as I quoted earlier from Kissinger and Vance and Ford and Carter, when we find ourselves in this position, I think our ability to control world affairs, or at least to influence world affairs, diminishes. The question has to do with our presentation in this country and in my newspaper about the defense budget and why it's always expressed in financial terms, and why aren't we getting a better fighting force for the money we're spending, and maybe you can deal with this, Mr. Cordy.
It's always in economic terms because defense is awfully expensive, because this country has undertaken to compensate with high technology for a smaller military force than its major adversary has. And I think on the whole, successfully. No matter what you've read, of which I probably have written some, the facts are that the U.S. Strategic Air Command has played a dominant role in keeping world peace since it was created immediately after World War II, and I have no doubt whatsoever could do exactly what it has been hired to do. You are referring to a series of small wars, and I'm reminded of Ensign Charlie Wilson, who was the Defense Department Secretary in the Eisenhower administration. I'm reminded of his comment that small wars are for small countries. Alas, big countries do at times get into them. We're not going to rehearse, I hope, all the little skirmishes that we have been in since World War II. I'll just say this, that if there's any suggestion that it was the military that lost the war in Vietnam, that is only at most a quarter of the story. And I don't think anybody wants to go into Vietnam anyway. The Marines who were lost in Lebanon, I guess that one has crossed your mind, were not sufficiently protected. On the other hand, the investigation held that the mission of the Marines was changed and they hadn't been told. They were sent there to be a peacekeeping force that was neutral, and they wound up having to fight on one side while exposed at an airport. They didn't do well. The country didn't do well by them. I don't know, I don't believe that the criticisms of the operation in Grenada are particularly well founded. One of them is that we sent too many people to do a job that the Marines could have done. There weren't enough Marines to do the job. And the decision was made to send a great deal so that as few as possible would get hurt because it would be an overwhelming force. I don't know any criticism whatsoever of the role performed in the Persian Gulf. On the whole, what the administration decided to do in the Persian Gulf has come out that way. Yes, it's true the Stark was badly damaged because it didn't shoot the airplane that was coming at it. It came down to that. So we're very critical of that. The next time an airplane came at a ship, we shot it down. We're very critical of that. It turned out it was full past. Believe me, far more than you have said, I understand, have read, and know, and am fully aware of. But I think that the main thing that the military forces of the United States exist to do is to prevent World War III, or maybe I should say World War IV, because the Cold War was World War III. I think that on the whole, they've done a quite creditable job, and so far as I know, nobody has undertaken to take them on in the cockpit, which is Central Europe. I'll continue to report objectively, Reg, having made that speech.
The question to Mr. Broning is to discuss a lot of facets of the Gorbachev leadership,
I was
particularly.
trying to formulate.
Yeah.
If he plans to be, he seems he wants to plan to be on every country's agenda.
Yes.
In the
but
world.
Can I?
Yes, sure.
When I was in the Soviet Union, there was a joke, probably still a joke. What happens if the Soviets take over the Sahara Desert? The answer, Russian joke. For the first 7 years, nothing. And then after that, a shortage of sand. The 7 years have run out. The Soviets understand this. Soviets are in dire, dire economic straits. They have some very good economic foundations. For example, their natural resources. They're now the world's largest producer of oil. They probably have the world's largest reserves of coal and a lot of other precious natural resources. But the fact is that the Soviets have not been able to make their system work, as everybody knows. So are the Soviets now a great economic power? The answer is no. Does he want to make it a great economic power? Yes. Does he want to diversify the Soviet contacts, economic and political, with the rest of the world, not basing it entirely on the United States? Yes, absolutely. But he's got a long way to go before he gets there.
I'm going to have to stop questions, I'm sorry. I'm going to ask my two colleagues to give us the benefit of their on-the-scene coverage of the Pentagon and the State Department, and to give us an idea of what we might expect from Tower, from Baker, and of course from President Bush. Do you want to start, George?
Sure. And this will give me a chance to say to the gentleman who was asking about the military forces and the economics and whatnot, something I neglected to say. The first thing, and the one thing I'm quite certain of, is that an effort will be made to, I hate the word, to reform the system for purchasing, developing and purchasing weapons. Mr. Bush is absolutely insistent on this. Secretary of Defense John Tower, who had much to do with instigating the build-up, will now have something to do with the build-down. And if he's going to go into the history books at all, it's going to be as a Secretary of Defense who tried to find out how to get more bang for a buck. We always say when we find that we have to reduce defenses and get more bang for a buck, that this is a result of a new assessment which holds that the enemy is not as terrible as we had previously thought. Well, I think we're seeing that new assessment already, and we've had some discussion of it tonight, because Gorbachev has already found out that he too has got to have a build down. Therefore, I think that we can confidently expect that there will be, and certainly the Defense Department will have much to do with this, a new agreement to reduce strategic nuclear weapons. I think it will come at a later date than we might think, and that it will cut them less than we might think, and that some of you might hope, but its design will be to have an agreement that stabilizes the nuclear balance so that neither country is tempted to shoot at the other one, because they will know that it means suicide. On the ground, in conventional arms, I think it's going to be much slower, because it's terribly, terribly difficult proposition to agree on reductions in conventional arms that are equitable. But my reasoning is that Gorbachev has discovered what we have long known, and that is that his military force is not good enough to take over Europe, the part of it that hasn't been taken over. And therefore, and they're certainly too big for any internal need that he has, and that therefore here's a good place for reductions. Moreover, that'll make his job at home easier. So I think you'll get conventional arms reductions, and that in turn will lead to that day that Franklin D. Roosevelt foresaw, for heaven's sake, and certainly Eisenhower did. Withdrawal of some American troops from Europe. This has got to be done under an arms control agreement rather than unilaterally, one would think. Otherwise, Moscow would have got something for nothing, and would have had less incentive to do anything on its own. These are the kind of things that I think. And finally, since nobody's brought up Star Wars tonight, which shows what kind of a sea change there is in the country, my guess is that you're going to see Star Wars, but the Star Wars will come to Earth, that there will be, if not in the first Bush administration, then in the one that he hopes will be his second one, a deployment of some form of missile defenses to defend our nuclear deterrent. I could go on for a long time, but Steve's itching to get in here.
Yes, thank you. From the first indications, from the early indications of President-elect Bush's appointments, and what we know of his own character, I think that this administration in foreign policy is going to define itself along two main themes, which are realism and prudence. I think there's going to be a diminution of an attempt to apply ideology to a reluctant world. I think that the world is going to be dealt with pretty much as it's found, and that a variety of means, probably less military than economic and political, are going to be employed to try and arrange the world according to American interests. Probably the best example of this, we haven't talked about much except the Soviet Union, perhaps the best example of this flexibility, of this realism, this pragmatism, will be displayed and will be evident in Central America, where for a number of years, in an undeclared policy, the Reagan administration has attempted to overthrow the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. I think you'll see under the new administration a much more modest goal, a goal that will be more in line with the politically acceptable means which exclude direct American intervention. I think you'll see much more stress on diplomacy. I think you'll see much more stress on working through the Central American powers and in trying to arrange a solution there whose object will be to confine Nicaragua to its own national borders so that it does not spill over and export subversion or revolution or straight military attack against its weaker neighbors. Another area, much more prickly, much less adaptable to change and to amelioration, is the Middle East. President Reagan, in a sense, with a very controversial decision, gave a present to President-elect Bush in the last days of administration by, in effect, recognizing the PLO, in effect, opening up a dialogue with the PLO. Like, this was intended to simplify the process, to advance it, to try and draw the PLO in and the rest of the Palestinians as a responsible force in negotiations. We're a long way from any sort of the kind of direct dialogue that the United States would like to see between the Israelis and the Palestinians, whether or not the Palestinians act on their own or with this joint Jordanian-Palestinian delegation. Here again, one would suspect that the Bush administration is going to apply more realism, but still founded on what the Bush people say is an unshakable commitment to the political and territorial and military integrity of Israel, and a pledge to maintain Israel's technological edge in military affairs over any combination of its neighbors.
I think we have run our allotted course. As usual, it's been a great honor for us at the Baltimore Sun to have such a large audience and such a wonderful audience, and I hope you'll invite us back again next year. Thank you.
Joe, let me just formally thank you on behalf of the council. We had a different array of questions than we usually have tonight, and I suppose that with the role that the media plays in the United States, and it's so enormous and it looms so large around most of us, that we have a great curiosity and reaction to the media and the representatives of it. And I don't think there's any doubt that the media has become much more important in the politics of this nation. But I do think that we have a strong feeling here in Baltimore that our foreign policy analysts and correspondents from the Sun discharge that enormous responsibility with a great deal of care and professionalism, and gingerly even. And we appreciate that and their presence this evening. Thanks very much.